Knows more than Stato, eh? Well, that's a big claim to start with. Thank you very much for the invite to come here to this beautiful place. I've not been here before, driven past it on a few occasions, but it really is a gorgeous setting. So thank you for turning up on a cold and dark evening. And it's been really interesting for me, really, to come back to this book, come back to this subject, because in that strange kind of way that COVID affected us all, where time sort of telescoped. 3 years ago, I was battling through the final versions of the manuscript, and I can still remember, Kevin and a few others from Newport coming up to the World Rugby Museum, where Charlie's shirts are kept now, for the launching of the book. Because with impeccable timing, within just a couple of weeks, we were in lockdown. And so it's been quite interesting really to come back to it. I did a talk in Risca a couple of months ago, and that was my first really opportunity to go back to the book and reread sections of it and think, that's terrible. But it's great to actually get back to the story. If you haven't read it, it's a book, obviously, it's a rugby book. It's also a book about the First World War, which is an area of interest of mine anyway. So it was a sort of natural sort of thing for me to do, really, was to pursue a story that I started to research for the Newport Rugby Greats book. Charlie's story kind of hooked me in, the human element of it. And I'll talk a little bit about that, obviously, during the course of the evening. But the trail, it became a little bit like a mix between a sort of a sporting documentary and sort of Cash in the Attic, because there was this period of time where I was on the trail of these shirts. We weren't really quite sure about the extent of the shirts, the quality of the shirts, but I finally got to meet two strands of the Pritchard family who, very conveniently for me, moved down to the south of England and were within just a half an hour's drive of where I live in Romsey in Hampshire. I met Geraldine, who was Charlie Pritchard's granddaughter, who sadly passed away last year, and Gareth Pritchard. And Gareth is the great-grandson, and he had the shirts. So I turned up there on a very, very rainy afternoon, and he shot upstairs to the attic and produced this big Tupperware box, and I didn't really know what to expect, really. And he popped open the lid of the box, and I took a picture of it there straight away, because it was one of those moments where, it was a little bit of a jaw touches ground moment, because there on top of the box, I saw immediately, although I'm not a memorabilia expert in any shape or form, that's an all-black jersey. And I'd seen enough pictures to know that is an all-black jersey from the 1905 game, the game where we absolutely stuffed the New Zealanders 3-0. And it is still lays some claim to being the most famous rugby game in Welsh rugby history. So famous, in fact, that when I was doing, I worked as a tour guide on the First World War Western Front, and I was at this obscure little cemetery somewhere in the north of France, and a van load of Kiwis got out of the van, and I struck up a conversation with a couple of them, and then one of them said, this guy over here, he's Welsh, and so I started the conversation, and this old boy came from the back of the cemetery to say to me, "You know it was a try, don't you? You know it was a try." But that's, that we share an awful lot, I think, with the New Zealanders' big rugby hearts and big rugby knowledge. But when that box opened, it was really quite a moment, really. We could tell by a very cursory look at the shirt. It's got a number 7 on the back. Now, of course, they used to number squads very differently, but we know from existing team sheets that the number 7 shirt was worn by a banker who lived in Taranaki called Frank Glasgow. So we're pitched back straight away. These shirts throw up stories the whole time. But we know that Glasgow was a crucial kind of player in that All Black team. So they played 35 games over the course of about 4 months. I think I'm right in saying, Kev, that for this season you're showing on the Black and Ambers website, I think you've got 25 fixtures. So that's running from the end of August right the way through to the end of April. So these New Zealanders came and played 35 games inside of sort of 4 months either side of Christmas. They were playing midweek and weekends. So, the sort of the physical constraints, by the time they played Wales, they were already carrying obviously some injuries, but we're not going to mention that. But they completely changed the game, really. These guys, they scored 976 points during the course of the 35 games. They only conceded 59 points. So it's an astounding kind of standard that they set. They shocked the home nations. They didn't expect this bunch of colonials to turn up and be quite so good. And they've carried on being like that for another 100 and odd years. But Charlie was was considered to be the man of the match in this game. So this shirt has a certain tells a little bit about the Charlie story. His old teammate Bernard Travers said that he was knocked him down like 9 pins on the day. So his defensive effort was crucial as far as the Welsh were concerned on the day. And obviously Glasgow was maybe his big opponent, and that's why he swapped that shirt. But when you start to get into this box, the deeper you delved into the box, the further, the more stories that came up. So the 3 shirts that I've got pictured there, one of them is over there, which is the Australia shirt. You can see with the red flower, which is the Waratah flower. So those 3 tours, the All Blacks of 1905, the Springboks of 1906, and the Australians of 1908, they are the 3, they're all first-time tours. So Charlie was just at that crucial time in rugby history when the game went international. So it tells you an awful lot, about rugby history, really. And it's the game, it's that tour where the All Blacks became known as the All Blacks, the Springboks became known as the Springboks, and the Wallabies were also christened. So you are right into rugby history, and Charlie is part of the Welsh team that takes them all on. And of that 3, it's just the Springboks that they failed to beat on this occasion, although Newport managed it just 6 years later. But Charlie himself makes it into the national squad pretty quickly. He's turning heads. Young, powerful. Even when you look at the pictures of him now, he looks like a modern player. He sort of looks, very, very strong. He's got an really athletic, square-jawed kind of look about him. He looks as though he'll do some damage. So he makes an entry into the national squad. And because of some illness, in actual fact, in 1904, he makes it into the starting side to play Ireland. Poor old Charlie was afflicted with some pretty bad injuries, particularly a chronic knee condition that eventually stopped him playing. He won 14 caps. Nowadays, you'd say that 14 caps is a pretty ordinary international career. A modern player will get 14 caps after a couple of seasons, maybe, if he stays fit. But you've got to bear in mind that mostly what you're talking about is a home nations tournament, which involves just England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So the most you're going to pick up in a year probably is 3, and then maybe an international fixture against one of these touring sides I just talked about. That's new. But even so 14 caps is actually, when you think about it, is actually quite a lot. But he probably missed out on another maybe 10, maybe 12 caps because of this injury, this knee injury that started to recur and keep him out for lengthy periods of time. So Charlie is a member of the first golden age of Welsh rugby. And I would say, if I want to start an argument in a pub anywhere, I would say that his side is, in quantitatively, I think, better than the 1970s side. Because their win rate and the way in which, the manner in which they won, the gaps between them and the opposition, and of course the crucial fact that they beat the All Blacks, puts them, I think, on a bit of a pedestal. And Charlie is absolutely, one of the first names on the team sheet. So this boy from Newport is right up there with the best in the world. I said home nations. There's a couple of other home nations shirts in the collection, one of which is here with us tonight, the Ireland shirt that you can see there, which very helpfully the Irish Rugby Union have put 1906 on, which stopped us having to scratch around and try and find out who might have worn it. But it's actually given away, because if you have a close look at the Ireland shirt afterwards, you'll see that the name of Tedford is written into the collar. Alf Tedford, big second row forward who played for Ulster. And Tedford was another big kind of opponent as far as Charlie was concerned, another key forward, another core forward. And Tedford went on to be the head of the Irish Rugby Football Union immediately after the First World War. And if you know your Irish history, you know that was a time when Ireland itself was in all sorts of trouble, big political issues, a civil war going on. Somehow, people like Tedford managed to keep Ireland playing as Ireland. He's an Ulsterman, Tedford, but he obviously, he and several others felt that rugby was one way in which Ireland could play as Ireland and not split up from the provinces. People like Tedford deserve huge credit for that. In fact, the debut match that Charlie had in 1904 was sometimes called Tedford's match because his performance turned the tide against the Welsh on that particular day. There's a Scotland shirt there as well. I was saying earlier on to someone, I really don't know how Charlie got hold of that, because the Scots were, you'd be surprised to hear this, really mean when it came to, I hope I haven't offended anyone here but they were really mean with in terms of handing out the shirts. So much so, there's a great story from after the First World War. There was a prop forward called Jock Weymouth, and poor old Jock had fought his way through the First World War. He'd been capped by Scotland before the First World War, 1914, and he'd then gone through the First World War. He'd lost an eye, and then he was sat in the changing room before the first international after the First World War, and watched as the team manager came in and dished out the new shirts to everybody apart from him. And Jock went over to him and said, you didn't give me a shirt. And the team manager said, you've already got one, haven't you? You've already got one from 1914. Where have you put that? So yes, they were known to be, yes, a little puritanical when it came to the amateur ethos. I think that is probably the nicest way I can put it. But there's also, of course, there's There's a couple more teams in the home. I forget who the white one is for the moment. But that rather nice blue shirt there, very classy French shirt. Charlie played in the first home nations Wales-France game. You'll see the Olympic rings there, rather than the famous cockerel, the Olympic rings, and that's because the Baron Coubertin, who was the man behind the Olympics movement, was also one of the prime movers in French rugby. He was a rugby ref, very well qualified rugby ref, and so the French rugby team sported the Olympic rings. Okay, I'll mention the white shirt. Charlie's last game, in fact, was in 1910, which was the last game against England. Was his last international, and it was the very first international at Twickenham. So we could well be looking, in this collection, we could well be looking at a shirt that comes from the very first international at Twickenham. This shirt caused a little bit of controversy, or a little bit of sort of head scratching. Thought it was Devonport Albion, because Devonport Albion have a kind of a red and white strip, and they appear on Newport fixture lists from way back. But there was something that was wrong with it. The bands were wrong from what I was looking at, and so I started to research a little bit more, read a bit more, and I caught sight of a photograph, which was of the Anglo-Welsh rugby tour of New Zealand and Australia from 1908, which I kind of disregarded because Charlie wasn't on that trip, because that coincided with his injuries. But sure enough, a little bit more work on this, and they agreed at the World Rugby Museum, this is actually a prototype Lions team. The 1908 Lions, the 1908 Anglo-Welsh appears on the Lions stats now, if you look at the Lions website. And they took a team over. The Scots and the Irish were kind of not keen because they felt that there was an element of professionalism about it. As a result of that, the RFU got very, very nervous about this being presented as a kind of a professional setup. So much so that, in fact, in the book I say that it's as if these guys went out on this tour consciously underprepared. So that, it's interesting, there's a chap called Boxer Harding who played for Wales, who was on the trip and in fact captained this side. And Boxer Harding, sort of in his memoirs and his interviews after the tour, said he felt the New Zealanders were far too keen. A bit too keen. And he was asked about preparation for a game. First of all, he said, well, it's absolutely out of the question that you should consciously prepare for a game. This seems astonishing to us today. But of course, there are lots of stories pre-1995 when the game went professional that really are quite amazing, really, in terms of it's really difficult to imagine anything kind of more backward in an attitude, like someone like a great rugby mind like Brian Price, our own Brian Price, being in a sense professionalized by writing something in a newspaper, writing an opinion column in a newspaper. We forget that now, perhaps, but the world of Boxer Harding, in terms of preparation, bearing in mind that at this time they were going up to a crucial test match against the All Blacks on their turf. The reports back from the New Zealanders were that they were being, quote, trained like racehorses. In comparison to that, here's Boxer Harding on his preparation for a rugby match. I indulge in walking as much as possible. It is a fine exercise. I am a smoker, but I knock off the weed for a week or so before an international match, and add to my walking a little running. The difference between attitudes between the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, right there, is kind of quite stark, really. Not surprisingly, the Anglo-Welsh were not startlingly successful, as a tour, but it is quite something for us to have that shirt available. So, of course, the big thing really, there are two Newport shirts. We've got the older one here. Here's the earlier one, and I mentioned that the contrast. You can see the other one, the colours are much, much more faded. You can see on the inside the collar on that it says CM Pritchard, and then it says captain underneath. Charlie captained Newport for 3 seasons. But there is a huge difference because Charlie was, as I say, ran into some pretty serious knee problems. And as a result of that, this shirt that's on the screen here is nowhere near as battered as the first one. If I could take the first one out for you, you'll see what I mean, but it would be, the shoulders are threadbare through hundreds and thousands probably of tackles. And this shirt almost looks pristine. The colours are startlingly good, really. But Charlie was a real servant of the club. Charlie played 219 games in a black and amber shirt. 219, and he only lost on 55 occasions. And that's an astonishing win rate, really, at any level. But he captained the side for 3 seasons, and that period of time for Newport Rugby Club, that too was a golden age. And Charlie was a core forward, really, in a pretty tough pack. When you look at a picture, of the guys in the pack with Charlie in some of those photographs. And I'm remembered there was an Irish commentator who said it was a shot before a European match with Munster playing, and the Irish commentator said something along the lines of, well, he says they're pretty good rugby players, although to be honest, if you took a photograph of the lot of them, it would probably work just to keep the kids away from the fire. If you put it on the mantelpiece, they're so ugly. But Charlie actually is a bit of a film star. He's got a sort of he's got a Hollywood look about him. But he is a very, very serious rugby player. He was a very, very serious, committed rugby player. And as he got to the end of his career, he showed his mettle, his devotion to the club by continuing to serve. And this is where the collection of shirts comes in. So he has built up a collection of shirts so that his mates, maybe people who've recently stopped playing, sometimes current players, he could get together 15 and they could play a married versus singles game or something that would get people in through the gates. And so you can see the extract there from the minutes. You can see that there's so it says, it was resolved to grant the use of the ground to Mr. C.M. Pritchard on April the 12th for a match, married versus single, in aid of Restoration Fund of St. John's Church, Maindee. So he manages to pull in a crowd for a charitable purpose. He's not collecting shirts the way that people do nowadays and flog them on eBay. He wasn't doing it for monetary gain. He was doing it because he could see that it was a way to generate some money that he could put to some use in the community. So that, for example, on another year, he raised money to collect kit to put together, I think it was for a rowing club down here in Newport. So he was very much committed to the idea that he had that power, he had that social capital, if you like, of being able to do something, draw a crowd, draw people, therefore draw money that he could use for good causes. So crowds would come to Rodney Parade and they'd watch these famous players trot around in Charlie's shirt, you'll notice that Charlie is wearing the All Black shirt. I say in the book, really, that Charlie's story, for me, it reminds me of all that's good about the game. In terms of its importance to a local community, the way it acts as a sort of a social cement inside a community. I know that sport generally does that, but I think rugby, the way in which rugby operates, is perhaps a little stronger in areas where rugby is big, where rugby is powerful. It does have this ability to pull crowds together, and people are there on a Saturday, and they have that. They builds up a relationship. So it serves communities by bringing them together. And Charlie saw that, and Charlie would be able to kind of think about that, reflect on that, and see that that was an opportunity for him to raise some cash. So, yeah, I would say it's one of those things that goes right to the heart of what makes the sport special. So, I said that there's a First World War story in here, and yes, so Charlie signs up. By which time he's not playing anymore, but he joins up. And when war breaks out in 1914, he is in the Gwents, and again, the kind of leadership the leadership role that he had at Rodney Parade, that he continued beyond his career, in actual fact, then takes him into the army, into the war. The picture there is probably taken when he's at Blackdown, at the training camp in Blackdown. He trains there, and eventually he winds up on a boat to Le Havre, and he lands in Le Havre on the 1st of June, 1916. Students of history will know that 1st of July, 1916 is the opening day of the Somme. But Charlie's not actually heading to the Somme. Some people assume, looking at the dates, they assume that he's a casualty of the Somme. He wasn't. Not directly. But what he does have, if he lands in France on the 1st of June, and he has the clock is ticking on him pretty soon. As an officer, we all know there's the famous 6 weeks analogy for infantry officers in the First World War. So Charlie moves towards the front, and if you look at the war diary, which you can see in Brecon, in the museum in Brecon, you can see that they gradually, as they move closer, they're being trained up. So they have a lecture on gas. They are then issued with steel helmets, the Brodie helmet that you'll see in photographs. Some people are quite surprised to hear that those helmets weren't standard issue immediately. In fact, it was only in spring of 1916 that the steel helmet was standard issue. But that, of course, when they start handing those out, the boys start to realize that things are getting more serious. They can hear the guns. They know they're getting closer. There is an example inside of their unit of someone who deserts. So they have to grapple with that in the dugout, the officer's dugout where Charlie is. They have to grapple with that and that problem and the problem of morale. Charlie's leadership skills have never been tested like this before. So there's a terrible accident during training behind the lines. They're trying to learn how to throw grenades. And this lad called Wesson, and you can see his tombstone there, from near Bethune, this chap Wesson fumbles a grenade and it kills him and their commanding officer. So things get real very quickly, should we say. And they know that they're heading, they're just a few days really away from being at the front line. Now, I mentioned that Charlie isn't killed on the Somme. He's killed a little further north. But what's happening at this time in 1916, when they get there in July 1916, when they get to the front line, they know that the Somme is happening just 50 miles or so to the south of them. Their commanders are determined that what the Germans shouldn't be able to do is strip their troops out of the defences further north to allow them to go down to the south to reinforce and stop the British advance on the Somme. So this pressure that they have to keep, this pressure that is applied then, has to be applied to stop that movement. So what they start to do is they start to launch what are called trench raids. And you can see the guys are all, in that picture, are all dressed up for a trench raid. They're not wearing their helmets because you could clang something against there. You have to move silently. They go with clubs and knives. And the idea would be that they would try and keep the German defences on their toes. So on the 12th and 13th of August 1916, Charlie is out in no man's land, crawling around with a group of his men, and they are just scoping out where in the German line they can attack in the middle of the night. Because what they want to do is they want to get hold of one guy, probably bash him over the head, drag him back across no man's land. Then they can interrogate him. They can find out whether he's got a pay book in his pocket, which all soldiers would have, and it would tell you what unit they're in. If they know that that's a strong unit, they know that that part of the line is well defended, or there's potentially an attack coming in. If it's a weak unit, a territorial unit that might be recently there, well, in that case, that might be a target for them to attack. So on the night of the 13th, Charlie leads an attack across no man's land. They have isolated a place that they think will be right, will be the right place to drop in. This is a trench map from the time. The blue lines are the British, red lines are German. It's a bit difficult to see, but if you have a look at the top, right just where you can see that the line comes straight and then starts to dip down. Those little kind of cartwheels that you can see are shell holes in no man's land. Okay? But if you look along the top, you can see one is Merthyr sap, and then it goes Brecon sap, and then there's Newport sap. So it's a pretty clear indicator that this trench map was made after August 1916, because they named some of the key points in no man's land after Charlie's unit. So Charlie went across that space. Nowadays, it's a piece of industrial France. Sort of over to this side, you go towards a town called Bethune. Anyone who drives down south of Calais, you pass Bethune after about 40 minutes drive south. So they're out in the countryside there. It's actually the old battlefield there's a battle in 1915 called the Battle of Loos. And they're actually fighting in the old battlefield of Loos. There is down here, there's a cimetière militaire de Marie-Haine, St. Mary's Cemetery. That contains the body of Jack Kipling, the son of Rudyard. So this is an area that's been fought over quite a lot during the course of the couple of years, 18 months. But anyway, Charlie launches an attack straight across that grey area there, really. He's crawling around in there. He drops into a German trench, and he gets hit in the wrist with a bullet, a stray bullet. But it doesn't stop him thumping a German soldier and then getting hold of him and then throwing him over the parapet. And they run back towards the British lines. They've got what they wanted. But they know they have to move fast because the Germans have been woken up and the Germans have pre-organized fields of fire. They know that it's going to get very, very hot very, very quickly. And as the hail of bullets comes across no man's land, Charlie is hit right at the top of the thigh. And in fact, this wound will eventually end his life because of the arterial bleeding that happens as a result. Charlie is taken back across no man's land by some stretcher bearers and along a trench and eventually winds up in a casualty clearing station just outside Bethune at a place called Choc. Unfortunately, his journey ends there. You can see there's a little bunch of flowers in front of one of the tombs. Every time I go there, a Welsh fan of some shape or form has left something. So Charlie, all that they know back at the unit is that he's been badly wounded. They think he's going to be okay in one report. But then later on the 14th, later in the day on the 14th, they get the crushing news that he's passed away. And the story comes out that that there is a sergeant alongside his bed, and Charlie briefly wakes up in the depths, he's slipping away into a coma, but he briefly wakes up and he asks, did they get the Hun? In other words, did they get this prisoner? Have they got hold of him so that he can be interrogated? And the sergeant says, yes, they've got him, Pritch, he's in all right. And Charlie's response is, I've done my bit. Hence the name of the book. But they were his last words. He slides away during the course of that night, and as I say, the 14th of August is the day he dies. There's a lovely quote by the writer G.K. Chesterton, who is the man who wrote the Father Brown Mysteries. He's a prominent writer at the start of the 20th century. And he said that the soldier doesn't go to war to fight what's in front of him. He goes to fight what's behind him. It's all about who you're fighting for, what you're fighting for, as far as G.K. Chesterton is concerned. And I think the Charlie Pritchard story reminds us of that. And trying to contemplate the family, the community loss for Charlie is sort of it's very, very difficult for people like myself who never, I've never had bombs landing in my general direction, and I've never had to go through all of that, and so how does Charlie's family deal with this? And you can see pictured there is his lovely wife Florence, and Florence has two sons, Mick and Cliff, and she has to figure out how to talk to them, how to tell them what's happened. She has to go through all of that. And she has to go through something else too, because Florence is pregnant. So Charlie's daughter is born in November, and Charlie's daughter will grow up never knowing her father. And she is the mother of Geraldine Phillips, who's one of the strands of the family that I picked up, and Geraldine always felt that there was this great yawning hole in the family. This tremendous sense of loss in the family as a result of Charlie's passing, and somehow there's this added frustration from his daughter's point of view of never having known Dad, but everybody in Newport did. Everybody in Newport felt close to him and saw him every Saturday, and so the disconnect there was huge, really, I think. But as I say, she's pregnant. She has the baby in November of 1916. She has to stay in bed for a number of days, not like the current situation where my daughter that had a baby recently, she was back home the following morning. So she was upstairs and in bed for a number of days. The morning she came downstairs to rejoin the family, the postman turned up and he was delivering a package which was Charlie's blood-stained uniform. So somehow this poor woman has to kind of come to terms with this. But in some ways she finds her way through it. One story that Geraldine told me was that every 14th of August was a difficult day in the family, a very difficult, almost as if a black cloud came over everybody, and nobody sort of communicated it at all. But she used to go out into the garden. Florence would go out into the garden and she would cut a rose from it, because Charlie was a great gardener. He loved gardening. And she went out and cut one of his roses and she put it on a vase on the table, on the dining table, and then she'd go to bed for the rest of the day. That was the 14th of August for her every year for the rest of her life. The daughter that was born, Rose, the daughter that was born, she died in 1985 on the 14th of August. So that was one of those astonishing kind of, obviously a coincidence, but it just shows you there's a sense of just how the power of the story, really. So this book became more than just a rugby book or a First World War book. It became a book about loss. It became a book about how to weigh up a life. But it was really a book about loss. The loss to the community, the loss to the team, but also fundamentally the loss to the family as well. And it was it became a combination of those things, I suppose. Barbara Tuchman, who wrote a very, very fine book called The Guns of August, she's writing about 1914 and the start of the First World War. Barbara Tuchman writes, the Great War of 1914 to 18 lies like a band of scorched earth dividing that time and ours. Which I think is it's just a fabulous statement. The difficulty of the historian, but the difficulty of all of us of getting into the past and trying to understand the past. If you reflect on it, if you think about it, for example, Charlie himself, historically, would have been closer to the men of Waterloo than he is to us now. So, the gap, if you like, gets ever wider for us, and that's why I suppose, that's why we're so keen. That's why they laid, you set up the service, the Remembrance service on Sunday, that's why the club still puts so much effort into trying to keep the memory of Charlie Pritchard alive because of what he represents, because of the importance. We recognise somehow the importance of remembering. Maybe these shirts help us get across that scorched earth. Maybe they just give us an opportunity to just get a touch, just get an idea of Charlie's life, of what was important to him, the people that loved him. And they remind us, I think, of the importance, the whole story, hopefully, would remind us of the importance of family and community, through dark times. I'm very happy to take some questions, but diolch yn fawr.